Today I'm going to talk to you about how to publish the data that you've collected across the Nansen Legacy project. It won't be possible for me to cover everything in detail in the next 38 minutes or so, but I aim to cover all the steps in the data publishing workflow, from tidying up your data right through to publishing it. I hope that this will give you an idea of where you can get started and where any gaps in your knowledge might be. And I hope that together we can identify any areas where it'd be useful for me to run extra sessions where I can go into more detail. But first, why do we go to all this trouble to publish data, and why do we make it so complicated? So I'd like to approach this from a slightly different angle today. Imagine your own data set. Alone, it's interesting to you and anyone you might share it with, but data go missing, people move on. So now as a community, we're pretty good at depositing our data with a data center. This is great, the data center take care of it, and we don't even have to keep our own copy of it anymore if we don't want to. And anyone can access that data by visiting the data center and searching for it. However, someone could only find your data if they know where they're looking for them. Basically, if they happen to be visiting the data center, or they're directed there from an article that you published or something like that. This is why data access portals like the one that is hosted by SciOS exist and why they're so important. If you're interested in data from Svalbard or the surrounding region, you should be able to access them through SciOS, or at least you should be able to if the metadata have been harvested from a data center. You can filter by the type of data that you're looking for, and it should be possible to download data from a number of different projects easily with just a few clicks. There are now even projects trying to create Arctic or even polar data catalogs, for example, Polder, which is linked here. These work by harvesting data either directly from the data centers or sometimes via more localized or regional data access portals. And I think this is going to revolutionize how we do science. Imagine being able to access data across the whole Arctic with just a few clicks. Thinking back to your data set, it would be now useful to a whole range of people working on all different types of projects, and maybe even in ways that you can't even imagine right now. But how is this possible? Well, in order to create data access portals like this, we need data to be findable. That means they're stored in a public repository. We need to have a DOI, which is a long-lasting way of uniquely identifying the data set. So if you happen to publish your data sets in two different places, it should have the same DOI in each case, so it won't be counted twice. And it should have rich discovery metadata. This is just metadata that helps someone to find and identify it, like the coordinates of where it was collected, the time and date, and any keywords. Data and metadata need to be accessible, not just by humans, but crucially by machines too. To pull so much data together, we need to be able to automate the process. There's far too much data for people to be able to do this all manually. And they need to be interoperable, meaning that the data and metadata can be easily understood by a range of different systems and softwares. This is made possible by using controlled vocabularies, which are essentially sets of terms which have been agreed upon, and they have descriptions that can be searched for online. So if I'm publishing data and you're using data, we both have a common understanding of what the data are. But also, again, since these vocabularies are searchable online, machines can understand the data. And this point with machines is really important, and a good tip to keep in the back of your mind whenever you're working with data is, would a machine be able to understand this? Or would I or someone else be able to write a script that could automate accessing or using these data? And if the answer to these questions is no, then perhaps there's a better way of doing it. And also the data center too needs to be interoperable with other platforms. So it needs to be accessible and interoperable so other portals can pull data from one to the other. And finally, the dataset needs to be reusable. So it needs to have a license stating who can use it and how. And you can include in this user access restrictions if you need to, saying that people can only use it under certain conditions. That's all fine. And it should have rich use metadata. So this is metadata that tells people how to use the data. So these are things like units and conventions and parameter names. So together, these are the fair data management principles. And whilst at a glance, creating a data set and publishing it in this way sounds like a lot of work, I'll outline what we are doing as data managers to try and simplify this across the project. I do understand that this takes a lot of time though, and you're all busy people. So I'll also outline what's in it for you. It promotes transparent research. Your data must be cited when they're used, just like when you publish a paper. It looks really good on job applications and funding applications. It's particularly trendy now, especially as you're showing that you're ahead of the curve and already doing something that's going to be more and more important and normal in the future. And it can lead to collaboration opportunities. Perhaps someone finds your data and wants to work on it with you. And of course, there's many more benefits as well. There's also some benefits of publishing data sooner rather than leaving it till later. It simplifies the process whilst you still know where everything is and what it is. Things easily get lost or forgotten over time, so it really will take you less time overall if you start the process earlier. This also speeds up the publishing of papers. A lot of journals now actually require that your data are published. So if this is already done, this is one thing less that can delay a publication process. And the faster that you publish your data, the faster they can be reused, the faster you get citations, and the faster we can advance as a scientific community. I'll outline a suggested workflow now. Note that some of these steps can be done in different orders, and that's fine, whatever works for you. But this is just one way that I think makes sense. Firstly, you need to decide what type of data you're going to be converting your data to. For most people in this project, this will be either NetCDF for physical data or Darwin Core Archives for biodiversity data. These two are self-containing file types, which means that the data and metadata are stored together, all in one place, all in one file. And there are standards associated with each of them. So someone else will be able to use your data. So, and a point here, please try not to just publish Excel files or similar. You might be able to understand them, but someone else probably won't be able to, and a machine certainly won't be able to. You then need to choose a data center that you want to publish your data to. These two things together will determine what you will need to do next and how you need to structure that data set. You might also be able to get help from a data center on the next steps. You then need to collect everything together, make sure everything's in order, make sure nothing's missing. And then you're ready to convert your data into NetCDF or Darwin Core. And finally, you can publish your data. At some stage in the process, please let me know where your data is going to be so I can make sure that they're made accessible through SciOS. This doesn't need to be at the end of a workflow. You can involve me in the beginning if you like, and of course just remember that it's my job to help you. And there's a number of ways in which I can help. I'm working on a step-by-step guide on how to publish data. This will expand on everything I'm talking about today and really go into the details on each step. And it'll include examples as we move along as well. There'll be workshops and webinars, and as always, let me know if there's anything in particular you want me to cover in one of these. And you can always contact me with questions, or you can contact the staff at the data center. It's in their interest to help you publish your data, and a number of the data center staff actually work on the project and attend meetings. So you're not alone in doing this. Okay, so let's go through this one by one, starting with deciding on a data format. So Darwin Core is a standard for publishing biodiversity data or ecological data. And an archive is the file format that allows you to do this. Traditionally, this was just used to record lists of species or specimens, which can be from processed DNA data, for example, even. But now this has been expanded to include different properties or measurements of species or specimens. And I've given you some examples here, but this standard is actually incredibly flexible in what you can record. You can basically record any measurement or property related to this specimen that you've collected. NetCDF was originally designed to store atmospheric data, but this has been expanded into the world of physical oceanography. This does also include some data that biologists are interested in, like chlorophyll A measurements, which is more of a physical property than related to an individual species. So just bear in mind that if you're a biologist, you might also need to be aware and work with NetCDF files at some point. Although, if you want to publish species data together with some of these physical properties, then and only then these data can also be stored in the same Darwin Core Archive. And I'll get back on how you can do this later. The next thing is choosing a data center. This one's quite simple. The only requirement here is that the data center contributes to SIOS. So in this case, there are 4 of these. Their contact details are here. Involve them. They'll be happy to help, I'm sure. Next, what do you need? You need discovery metadata, which helps someone find the data, and use metadata, which helps someone use the data. There are conventions that describe which terms you need to include and how you populate them, and this actually depends on the file type again. So let's start with NetCDF. You have the ACDD conventions for discovery metadata. And if you visit this page, you can scroll down and you can read about the standard. But what's really important is you have a list of highly recommended terms and recommended terms, each of which has a description next to it and tells you how to fill it in. I've created guidelines for some additional terms that should be included for Nansen Legacy datasets, and you'll be able to find all of this in the how-to manual that I mentioned earlier, or just ask me. For the use metadata, we have CF conventions. So this is a list of so-called standard names for different parameters. And you can scroll down and find one that might be suitable for you. So let's have a look at air pressure, for example. We can open it up by clicking on it. And there's a description of exactly what we should use this term to represent. And it recommends also which units you should use to store the data with. And I'd recommend that wherever possible, you can convert your data or your values to comply with these units. And it's also possible to to search for different names as well at the top. So if we're looking for something to do with sea ice, for example, we have a variety of different standard names that we can choose from here. It might be that you can't find a suitable standard name for what you're working with. We are investigating a whole range of data across this project, and I'm sure this standard doesn't encompass everything at the moment. But if you find anything missing, please contact me, and we can together propose that these standards are extended. It's much better to do this collectively and send a long list of suggestions in a single email rather than bombarding the standards body with emails with individual suggestions. So just let me know if anything's missing. And a good advantage of doing this is that by proposing new standard names to be added, we are expanding the standard to encompass a wider range of data, and that'll be more useful for scientists in the future. For Darwin Core Archives, we have Darwin Core terms for the use metadata, and we can find them here. And actually, the sample log is based on many of these terms. So this is a page for the Darwin Core terms. On the right-hand side here, you have a list of classes, where a class is like a category for different terms. And we can scroll down or go to one of these classes, and we'll see in the event class in particular, many of these terms will look familiar, like event ID, parent event ID. Each term has a definition, some comments, and also some examples of exactly how you can fill it in or some best practices. And there's the ecological metadata language for discovery metadata. I'd actually recommend that you don't really worry about this, because when you create a Darwin Core Archive, you'll most probably use a tool called the Integrated Publishing Toolkit. And then you just need to fill in a form, and that will tell you which metadata you need to add. And I'll cover this Integrated Publishing Toolkit towards the end of this talk. The next step is to work out how you're going to structure your data sets. So this is my drawing of a Darwin Core Archive. It's basically a set of CSV files and XML files, which are zipped together just like a zip folder. You have a core CSV file, and then optionally some extension CSV files which surround it, although sometimes you can just have the core. So each of these CSV files has a number of columns, each of which has a Darwin Core term as a header. And you have some rows, and each row has its own unique ID. They're set up in what's called a star schema, which basically means that the central core is linked to each extension file using the IDs. So it's clear how they relate to each other. And a common question here is why do we bother with multiple files and not just lump everything together? Well, the extension files allow us to map many to one relationships. So for example, if we have multiple species found by a single sampling event, we can log the sampling events in the event core in this case, and we can have an occurrence extension which just logs the species as a subset of that. And this cuts down on duplication of information, which I'll cover later. As well as these, you have a meta.xml file that describes the structure, basically which columns are included in each file, and identifiers that points to where the Darwin Core terms can be found online. And finally, you have an eml.xml file, which is the ecological metadata language I mentioned earlier. And this just includes metadata that describes the dataset as a whole. So an abstract for people who are involved, etc. You don't need to worry about these XML files. They'll be created automatically when you start creating your archive using the Integrated Publishing Toolkit. Again, it's just filling in a form and uploading your data. For the majority of Nansen Legacy datasets, I recommend you use an event core as your core CSV file. And right away, you'll recognize some of the terms at the top as Darwin Core terms from a sampling log. Each row, in this case, is a sampling event. For example, a CTD cast, or a net haul, or a trawl. And you log all the metadata related to this event in this core. So for example, the event date, the coordinates. This way you only have to log this data here once for each event, rather than logging it for each occurrence. This can be hierarchical. So in this case, the first row with UUID 1 is the parent of the next two rows with UUIDs 2 and 3. So this might be something, for example, like a CTD with some Niskin bottles bolted to it. You then also need an occurrence extension where one row is a single species that you've identified from each event or a specimen. So here, from event 2 in our event core, we have 2 species logged in the occurrence extension. And you can even have a column that tells you how many individuals you've logged from that single event of the same species. So this occurrence ID, in this case, is unique for each row in the file, and the event ID links to the event core. So this is a bit different to in your sample logs. You might have logged samples before with their own event ID. But in this case, if you have done that, you can just use that same ID and just stick it as the occurrence ID in this case. And the event ID is then the parent of those, if you like. That's a little bit confusing, but have a think about it and hopefully it'll make sense, or come back to me if you have any more questions. Then in some cases, but by no means in all cases, you'll have a horribly named measurement or fact extension. So here you can log different measurements or you've made of different specimens or species or different properties. So for example, their weights or their body length. But in reality, this can be anything where you've taken a measurement related to a single specimen or an entire species from a single sampling event. So here we have the third ID column, the measurement ID, which is again unique to each row, and you have an event ID and occurrence ID, which allows you to see which occurrence and event it's related to. So here we're taking 2 measurements from the same specimen with UUID 4 as occurrence ID. And then you have a measurement type, and the best practice here is to take this from a controlled vocabulary. And you have a measurement value and some measurement units. You can also record in more information here, like physical properties of the environment, for example, temperature or chlorophyll A concentration. And this can even be logged at different sampling depths. And you can also record information related to the instrumentation or the gear that you've used, again from a controlled vocabulary. So here we have the sampling gear name as our measurement type, and either CTD or Niskin bottle for the various measurement values. Again, I can see that this might seem a bit daunting, creating these 3 separate files and making them relate to each other, but I can help with this. So everything you need to include in your event log has actually already been included in the sampling logs. And this is now available in the metadata catalog on SciOS. So I'm working on a tool that will allow you to retrieve this information automatically, and will just create your event log for you, as long as you provide some IDs for your sample that can relate to those events. But in the meantime, if you're doing this before this tool becomes available, just contact me and I'll help you create this. It should also be possible for this tool to retrieve the gear types, for example. We might be able to assign the different terms for some of them where possible, at least for in the majority of cases, I hope. And you also might have logged your occurrences or your different species as events in your sample logs. So we might be able to get those back too. So you're not starting from scratch here. But I'm well aware that this is probably the most daunting part of the workflow for many people, creating these kinds of files. So certainly different separate sessions will be run to focus more on this. Okay, let's move on to NetCDF. So NetCDF is very well suited to storing multidimensional data, and it does this by storing samples on multidimensional grids. So this is a simple example. We're looking at wind speed across different latitudes, longitudes, and times. So we have 3 dimensions that you can see here: longitude, latitude, and time. Each of them has an assigned length of 3, which means we have 3 points in each dimension. But note that this tells us nothing about what the actual values for that dimension are. Instead, we log that as variables. So these variables are essentially arrays for each variable. So let's look at the longitude variable first. We can see that there are 3 values, 28, 29, and 30, and we can see that there's only a single dimension related to this variable, which is, of course, the longitude dimension of the same name. Latitude is similar, and for time we have 3 values, 0, 1, and 2. It gets a bit more complicated when we look at wind speed. So here we have a multi-dimensional array with 3 dimensions: longitude, latitude, and time. We also have a fill value that you can see here in red, 3 times 10 to the 7. And this can be any unrealistic value that we've assigned to show that no data exists in this point. And we refer to this fill value in the metadata. Then when someone uses the data, they can identify what this fill value is and filter them out. And there are some things that aren't required by default by the different conventions that I'd recommend to include into a NetCDF file specifically for the Nansen Legacy project, at least where applicable. So that is any event IDs that are associated with the data set that you're publishing, and also the URL of the metadata catalog on SciOS. So this will help someone who finds a data set to also find the sample or samples in the metadata catalog. And this might include more metadata than you are publishing in the dataset itself. It'll also perhaps help them to navigate through the catalog and gain some more insight into how everything relates to different data in the project. And also the section of the sampling protocols should be referred to if you have included that in the published documents. So let's move on to collecting everything together and cleaning your raw data. The first thing is to retrieve an updated version of the sample log from me. So there's a tool in development that will help you to do this, but in the meantime, before this becomes available, just contact me and I can just get that for you. It'll work by just providing a set of IDs, and then the up-to-date metadata for those IDs will be brought back into a Excel sheet or CSV file. But why do you need to do this? Well, this is because there's a lot of checks and corrections that are performed on the sample logs once I receive them to try and filter out any mistakes that have been made and to make things consistent across the project. So for some columns, we have time, data, the coordinates, for example. Your samples in your sample log should have the same values as the activities or the sampling events that are the parents of them. So we have a script. When I receive the sample logs, we can propagate this metadata from the parents and copy it down to the children. Other fields are checked and cleaned manually, sometimes fixing random errors. This can happen, but also to ensure consistency in how things have been recorded across the project. So after this, after you've collected everything into one file or however many files that you need, you should then check for each column names matches what it should in the controlled vocabulary. You don't have to do this, but I think it makes it easier later if your columns are already called what they will be as fields in the final datasets. And finally, you clean your data. So if fields from the controlled vocabulary state how the data should be formatted, make sure that your data already conforms to these standards. And make sure you're consistent in how you're handling any missing values. Really, consistency is king here. Either you'll be writing some code to convert these data into one of these file formats, or you'll be using a tool that will do this automatically for you. But in either case, this is a lot easier if you're consistent to begin with. Okay, the next step, finally, you're wanting to convert your data to create one of these file types. So for NetCDF, there are modules or libraries available in most common programming languages to help you create NetCDF files. I've written some examples using dummy data in Python, and I'll be doing some examples as well for R at some point. You can follow them all by following this link here. If you don't like coding, don't worry. There's a tool available hosted on SciOS called Rosetta. And this comes with a user interface. So it's more like you're uploading your files and you're just filling in a form and telling it how the data relates to each other and assigning some metadata. When you've created your file, you can check that it's okay. And there's a file validator for NetCDF files on SciOS. Or you can, of course, send it to me to check and I'll have a look at it for you, see if anything's missing, see how it is. And there's some help already on how to create these files on SciOS. So there was some webinars hosted back in April, and they were recorded, so you can go and take a look at them. There's also a lot of help online as well with these things, depending on the method that you're wanting to follow. For Darwin Core, I'd recommend that you use an integrated publishing toolkit, which was developed by GBIF. A word of warning that at the time of recording, you probably won't be able to do this yourself. We're trying to get a server installed on Nerd that you'll be able to log into and use this IPT, the Integrated Publishing Toolkit. In the meantime, NMDC have one of these installed, so you can contact them and send your data across and they'll do some of this work for you, but please involve me in the discussion if you do contact them. The IPT looks like this. You can upload your source data, and these are basically the CSV files that you've created. You then map each of the column headers to Darwin Core terms. Well, we've already done this by creating CSV files that already have Darwin Core terms as headers. So in this case, we go to the mapping, and this is just automatic. It will be done for us. Any columns that aren't mapped, we can then look at the different column names we have used and select an appropriate Darwin Core term for them. And then you can add some more metadata, which will go into the eml.xml file, the ecological metadata language that I talked about earlier. So this is just filling in a form. It looks like this. There are lots of different fields that you can fill out, but crucially, only some of these are mandatory. So just work through these and fill in anything you think is important or appropriate. You can even actually publish data to GBIF from the integrated publishing toolkit, but I'd advise you please not to do this yet. This is because, unfortunately, metadata from GBIF can't be harvested into SciOS. Apparently, this just isn't possible. So we have a workaround, and I'll cover this shortly. But for now, you can publish it privately. This will mean that only you can see it, and then you download it so you have your own archive on your PC. Finally, when you've created your dataset, it's time to publish it. So how do you deposit it with different data centers? So again, these are the data centers that you contribute to SciOS. So just choose one of these if you haven't already. NERD, Research Data Archive has a nice user interface, which I think is quite easy and quick to use. So I like that. At the Meteorological Institute, they're creating one of these at the moment too, but that's in development at this point. But if you want to publish with any of the other data centers, you can start the process by just emailing them. Also, just make sure again that I'm kept in the loop. That's so I can make sure that these data are made available through SciOS, and then we'll be able to access all of our data from the project through a single point. And also make sure you inform the data center that this is a Nansen Legacy dataset. It should then be tagged as such, and then again we'll be able to filter using this tag when we're searching via SciOS. The data center will give you a DOI that you can cite when you're publishing your papers. If you biologists and want to publish your data to GBIF, you can do that, but you can use the same DOI. So it's possible to do that. Just get in touch with the Norwegian node of GBIF. Their email address is here, and they'll help you do that. And do consider writing a data paper. This is separate to a scientific paper, but this instead describes the data itself. So how the data were collected, processed, analyzed. And this can be similarly published in a peer-reviewed journal and can be cited just like a scientific paper can. And that's everything. Thanks very much for listening.